This type of equation here is in quadratic form, meaning that it itself is not a quadratic equation, but we have this relationship between the two powers on the variables, where that larger power, that 4 in this case, is 2 times the smaller power. So that smaller power of 2 times 2 would be 4. Anytime we have that relationship, then the equation is quadratic in form. Because a quadratic equation, we have a power of 2 and a power of 1. And so that higher power is double the smaller one. So whenever we see this, we make a substitution that allows us to write this as a quadratic equation. The substitution that we make is typically use the letter u and let that be equal to that variable expression to that smaller power, in this case x squared. If I allow u to be x squared, then where I see the x squared in this equation, I'm just going to replace it with the letter u. Now when we get over to that x to the 4th, we need to have something to replace that with as well in terms of u. And so we see that if u is x squared, what happens when we square u is that we would have to do x squared squared, and that would give us x to the 4th. So I then get to replace this x to the 4th with u squared. So everything else is still there, so that's minus 5u plus 6 equals 0. Now making that substitution, we see that we end up with a quadratic equation. And so we can solve that either by factoring or by the quadratic formula if we have to. And that's the real benefit of making the substitutions, that we have all those tools available to solve quadratic equations. So this one can be factored. It would be u minus 3 times u minus 2. And then set each of these factors equal to 0 and solve. So we get u equals 3, or u equals 2. But now we have to keep in mind that we were not trying to solve this originally for u. We were the ones that stuck a u into the problem. So we need to solve this equation for x. So this is where I go back and look at that substitution that I made, and I see it written down up there as u equals x squared. So now I'm going to go back and put x squared in place of the u. So u was x squared. So I actually have x squared equals 3, or x squared equals 2. Now I need to solve each of these for x. So to get x by itself, I'd have to take the square root of both sides. Anytime we do that, we got to use our plus or minus. So I get plus or minus the square root of 3. And same thing here in the second one, I'd get plus or minus the square root of 2. So I actually end up with 4 solutions for x here. I would have negative square root of 3, negative square root of 2, positive square root of 2, and positive square root of 3. And each of those 4, any of those 4, would work in the original equation.